Hi, everybody, and welcome to The Love That Loves You Back, a podcast between myself, Valerie Kabov, and my dear friend Jonathan Fremantle. I'm an artistic miscreant, otherwise known as a self-described third-generation art professional, who's currently raising a fourth-generation art professional, born in the depths of the Pale of Settlement in the former Soviet Union, and partly raised in Australia, lived and worked in London and Paris, and 15 years ago, by a quirk of fate, relocated to Zimbabwe, where I'm the co-founder of First Floor Gallery Harare, trying to figure out life, education, art, and predominantly love of art as life goes on. And without further ado, over to Jonathan.
Thanks, Valerie. Yeah, Jonathan Fremantle. I grew up in Cape Town and studied in London. I did a long apprenticeship in fine art in the old sense, and have been more making art in one way or another ever since then. I live in Edinburgh now, but I also lived for a while in Johannesburg, where I had Hazard Gallery, and that was the context that I met Valerie about 10, 12 years ago, and just loved the conversation we had immediately about painting and how painting is everything. And that conversation's been a constant source of joy and sustenance over the years. So it does make sense that we share the conversation, and look forward to where this goes.
Yeah, no, I mean, and it usually goes anywhere and everywhere, but somehow we always come back to art, and
Yeah,
because it is the love that loves us back. Thank you very
right.
much for joining us, and we look forward to sharing the journey. Today, we're welcoming another guest on the program. It's a very privileged spot to be a guest on this podcast, because normally we're just way too happy talking among ourselves. Today, our guest is Craig Yee, who's joining us from Beijing, and we're thrilled. Craig and I met virtually during lockdown, and I thought that Craig was a person who's like one of the very few people I speak to in the art world who actually had some interesting discordant ideas that I thought somehow challenged and fascinated me. And I thought this is exactly the sort of conversation that we should be having across different cultural perspectives in the art world, in a way that is both nuanced, intelligent, and intellectual. And I thought this would be a really good conversation to have, especially because Jonathan and I get to be, we're very rooted in the European tradition in many ways, even though we are outward looking, but we acknowledge our own sort of pedigree in that regard. And so I think it's important that we challenge ourselves, and just for intellectual honesty and integrity of our wherewithal. So with that in mind, Craig, can you please maybe tell us a little bit about, first, to introduce our audiences to your practice. You're based in Beijing, but you were also dividing your time between Beijing and New York for quite some time. You are a curator and a director of a gallery project specializing in traditional Chinese calligraphy-based practices.
Thank you for that kind introduction, and I feel very honored to be joining your your discussion, your podcast here today. And I do remember our conversations, and the feeling was entirely mutual. So what our program is, when I present our program internationally, people respond, "Oh, what a marvelous niche you have as a gallery," and that is we represent artists who are using the traditional language from East Asia of ink painting and calligraphy and creating contemporary art, global contemporary art from that. And I love that comment, "Oh, what a wonderful niche," because in East Asia, if you actually were to go anywhere in China, Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, which is a fairly large part of humanity, and you were to talk to them about what art form truly represents your culture, your history, your literary thinking, your religious thinking, your philosophical worldview, your everyday cultural lives, the number one answer I get in this region is calligraphy, and the number two answer I get in this region is ink art. Okay, and so it's not a niche in East Asia. It is, in fact, the primary way in which East Asian people think about their cultural heritage. And so to be able to take this and then ask the question, why is it that when you go into the contemporary art world, you see almost none of this? Okay, and then so our gallery was really designed to ask this question and to propose some answers as to why, and in proposing those answers, get more of this art seen globally and internationally. Because I think that without that being part of the global art discourse, contemporary art discourse, we're kind of missing the worldview of a significant portion of the world's population. Now, it just so happens that part of the reason why it hasn't been well accepted internationally is because it's based on fundamentally different cultural premises and philosophical premises. And therefore, what makes it interesting, profoundly interesting, is flattened and not visible within frameworks that we use in the contemporary art world. It's a translation question. And even if you translate into a language that's being used in the contemporary art world, it flattens all of the depth, the conceptual depth of what's actually going on, because there's a shift in worldview that's actually going on, and it can be very profound philosophically what those differences are. But when we do those translations properly, then the ideas become visible. You need to take a step back, and when you present those ideas, and then it becomes exciting, because by listening to the propositions of another culture and another history, we actually can dramatically expand the philosophical or conceptual foundations of our own contemporary art practice. So that is the great possibility or the great potential of fostering this kind of dialogue. So that's the work that our gallery tries to do. And if this doesn't sound terribly commercial, there is a new initiative that we set up in New York called the Ink Institute, specifically to support, shall we, the more institutional or the more scholarly, the non-commercial aspects of doing this work. And that's allowed us to work more and more with other institutions who are interested in these same questions.
I find the word translation really, really interesting. And I want to segue. I'm wondering, because we talk a lot about painting, like a lot. In fact, we talk about painting on this podcast more than anything else. But I wonder whether some of the issue of translation and of concepts is also that in contemporary art, a lot of translation happens into painting and painterly language from different practices. We tend to relate everything to the European painting tradition. Even the concept of landscape and portrait, which is now a broad-based one, emerges from this like uniquely Western perspective, because it does not relate to how other people write and see things, right? And you specifically wanted to talk about textile and ceramic art and how, I guess, the artisanal practices, or the so-called artisanal practices, have been sort of translated, you would say, into contemporary art form, because both ceramics and textiles are so hot right now. I'm also thinking of how to look at it in a more sincere, I guess, for lack of a better word, authentic way. And perhaps you can speak more to that from your perspective.
Okay, so the reason why I brought up the question, the issue of textiles and ceramics, is one of the things I've observed is that, I mean, I'm all for it. I think it's so fantastic, actually, that the contemporary art world has embraced what might have been considered traditional artisanal practices into the various choices that a contemporary artist can choose in presenting their ideas. But what I've noticed is that the people who gain purchase by using ceramics and by using textiles are typically contemporary artists who are appropriating or using an artisanal language to express their ideas. This is not always the case, but what I would say is, for the most part, people who are trained contemporary artists who are using these media to express their ideas, they are the ones who gain purchase. Whereas if you go to anywhere around the world and you meet the artisans who have actually spent a lifetime mastering the media, mastering the languages, mastering the techniques, they're oftentimes employed by contemporary artists to produce their objects, but the artisans themselves are not treated as contemporary artists. And so why is this? Couple simple, but I think very simple thing. I think the conceptual turn in art in the 1960s basically means that there's a set of ideas where that artists are expected first and foremost to be thinkers, and that they get to choose what language or medium they use to express their ideas, but we judge them based on their ideas, the relevance of their ideas, and then the power of the expression through the media. But the media, in a way, becomes secondary. So first and foremost, we place the idea of the artist first and foremost. And the assumption is that artisans, the trained artisans who have mastered, say, the traditional craft, lack conceptual content in their creation of objects, and therefore don't qualify as contemporary artists. And this is something that I meet consistently when I present ink artists or calligraphers. They're considered either artisans or traditionalists who do not deal with contemporary art ideas and are not part of a contemporary art discourse, and therefore don't have, as Joan Key would say, standing in the contemporary art world, to use a legal term. And I would challenge this. So I deal with contemporary ink artists all the time. And if you look at the depth of ideas that they're engaged in, whether they're religious ideas, philosophical ideas, literary ideas, historical ideas, okay, ideas about embodied cognition and experience, there's a whole range of ideas that these people are dealing with, oftentimes couched, though, in a traditional language or a traditional lexicon, okay, that because it is not translated into language that contemporary art curators have been trained to understand, the assumption is that this conceptual content does not exist. And I think that's just categorically false. That's a huge error and a huge mistake. And so when I start dealing with artisans, for instance, what we might consider to be artisans, for instance, the contemporary ceramicists in Japan, okay, if you go back to the post-war moment when in Kyoto, you had ceramicists who had always been creating functional vessels in service of some other art form or some other purpose. For instance, tea bowls for tea ceremony, or flower vases for ikebana, or some other art form. Okay, so there's always art for something else, not for itself. And then you realize there's a group of ceramicists who make the very radical choice to create non-functional ceramics. Okay. You may sit there and you say, okay, that's a simple move. Okay, it's certainly a very modernist kind of move to make. But I think there's a failure of appreciation that all of these vessels that they had been making before had real sociological, ritualistic use and meaning. And therefore, to intentionally reject that sociological meaning and that ritualistic function is, in fact, a radical choice, a profoundly radical choice that is not abstraction, okay, which is how this art is framed, always framed within this Western notion of visual mimesis, departing from visual mimesis. We call that abstraction. Why on earth are we applying that idiotic concept to a rejection of ritual function in society? The move is conceptually completely different, and yet we flatten it when we try so idiotically to do this translation. So what I think really needs to happen is we need anthropologists and sociologists talking about ritual function of objects and vessels, and then talking about the significances of what it means to reject this ritualistic function in society. And I would just argue that in East Asia, the idea of ritual and function is, in fact, the bedrock of how society is constructed. This is not an epiphenomenon. This is a fundamental core means by which societies function and acculturate their individuals. And so this is like core things, core to the East Asian identity. To reject this is a profoundly radical move that is just simply not appreciated.
What you're saying really resonates in so many ways. And I think also there's a yearning from Western artists to kind of envelop themselves in that ritual and that meaning and that kind of function. So they look to the East and they look to these practices and sort of reach towards it because that's what they're hoping to rub up against somehow. And there was an anecdote. Hokusai was asked how long it takes to paint Mount Fuji. And he said, you go and meditate for 20 years, and then on the 21st day of the 21st year, you can paint Mount Fuji. And there's something magical about this process. The time that it takes to make a thing is involved in the thing itself. You know, there's so many layers to it. And it seems odd that we can't see that.
And I also blame, postmodernism. I wanted to specifically ask you about, you said like anthropologists and sociologists should go in. I mean, I would assume you mean anthropologists who are not Western anthropologists, because there's also that kind of, notion of embeddedness, which I first came across in actually in African art, where most of the descriptions and studies in African art have been done by, American anthropologists who first arrived in Africa as part of Peace Corps in the 1960s and just fell in love and then embedded themselves in doing field work in villages, and which, like, to anyone who's lived, on the continent or in any society, would realize that as a foreign object in another society, you don't see, and you're not presented with things that you can see in the way that is at all authentic. I would assume the anthropologists you want are not, Harvard University Anthropological Society fellows.
Let me put it this way. So the 1.0 of anything oftentimes is highly problematic. But I would not say that the crimes of maybe the 1.0 researchers needs to taint the entire methodology. So I'll give you an example. Let's say we're talking about a tea bowl. Okay, so what do we need to actually understand how a tea bowl functions? Couple things is, one, you should drink tea from the tea bowl. Okay, the second thing is you should use that tea bowl within a ritual that is live today or potentially reconstructed from historic records, so that you can actually experience in an embodied way how this actually functions, this object functions, and then what the experience is. I think that art historians who focus on tea ceremony will be able to answer many, many of these questions. Okay, but they're going to have a very, very limited point of view in terms of what the art historical or art history, okay, as a field, the methods that are endorsed, they will be able to use those methods in order to unpack to some degree what tea ritual basically means. But I think it would help, for instance, to actually have a scholar who understands the idea of ritual, the role that ritual plays in society, the way ritual helps define relationships, the way ritual functions in an abstract way, in addition to the art historian's specific perspective, which may focus on objects, dating, authentication, material practice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So multiple dimensions coming together. And then what's missing really is the contemporary art perspective. Okay, so how would, from a contemporary art perspective, do we look at this ritual and its meaning, and therefore an artist's decisions and moves within this context to either reject function or to transform function or what have you? And I think a lot of that depends upon, if it's use that we're talking about, you need people who have actually engaged in the rituals and used the objects and understand the practice, okay, to then understand what the artist has done to that practice, to that cultural practice. So that's all I mean, is that I think that if you would rely on art historians, you might be missing a key dimension, which might come from sociology or anthropology. And that if you were to bring those two together, you would again probably be missing the contemporary art curatorial relevance of what's actually going on. And what I will say is there's a whole swath, okay, that Jonathan alluded to, this idea of art as personal cultivation, okay, which just seems so solipsistic and self-indulgent that we don't give it any significance, okay, in terms of contemporary art practice, because contemporary art needs to be serious social, political stuff. And the idea of an artist engaging in a self-indulgent self-cultivation practice just seems anathema to the idea of socially relevant contemporary art. But there is a lot. If we were to talk about this notion that the foundation of anything political starts with the individual in East Asia, that notion has to do with the responsibility that we all have to cultivate ourselves. Now, one of the things that artists do in this self-cultivation practice is they create traces of their practice. And then this is what other people are engaging with. So if you were to think about, for instance, the significance of religious art and, shall we say, our own individual relationship to God as mediated by art, but then also controlled and mediated by institutions and social power, right? And how that becomes extremely problematic. The East Asian approach oftentimes is you're responsible for your own self-cultivation. You can choose your own path of self-cultivation. and that your inspiration literally comes from your peers who are also on their own self-cultivation practice. And then the artwork is in fact a trace of your practice, and then provides the basis for a dialogue of peers, as opposed to a hierarchical dialogue between a god, a church, and a supplicant, right? So that relationship is very different. A hierarchical relationship on the one hand, and arguably in its ideal form, a dialogue of peers, of fellow travelers, okay, is the way we oftentimes think about a lot of East Asian art practices. So not to say that there isn't hierarchy, but that's kind of the ideal in some contexts. So where does that kind of practice fit in a global contemporary art practice? It doesn't exist. Anyone who's doing that is going to be immediately dismissed as kind of solipsistic and disconnected from the world.
I just realized that that's exactly what I'm doing in the gallery at Personal Galleries, that we have a conversation of peers. That is like the neatest definition of what it is that we're doing, Craig. Oh my God, we do exist, and that explains why we're at odds with everyone, is because we're just cultivating personal practices that leave traces. Good God, you've solved my life, Craig.
Well, okay, so this is the thing. This is the thing. Okay, this is what I find the biggest resistance point is, or one of the biggest resistance points is, in terms of global curation, accepting a lot of what our artists do. But when I present what our artists do worldwide, whether it's in India, whether it's in Central Asia, whether it's in the Middle East, whether it's in Africa, what I find is people are sitting there, they're nodding their heads. And then a lot of artists come up to me afterwards and they say, in Uganda, we have this too. And then people in India say, in India, we have this too. I mean, I feel like the exception really is the way we've constructed things coming out of this Euro-Anglo tradition. That's the peculiar piece of it, right? And that the rest of the world is saying, okay, we can do that, okay, if we must, okay. But actually, what we are doing, if we were to really be honest about what is meaningful to us and what we think is culturally and socially relevant to our societies today, might be something different. And I find what you talk about going on in China with ink artists and calligraphy, even though we don't have those art forms at all, we don't have that tradition at all, I find the ideas deeply resonant and very close to, homologous to what we're doing here, or we're doing there, or we're doing elsewhere. So I do think that, Jonathan and I talked about this idea of Global South. I do think that there is a space, a huge space, this is the global majority, in which these ideas hopefully can circulate without there needing to be intermediation from the global north, where these forms of art making and the relationship between individual and society and history, okay, can be reconfigured to embrace more of the world in its artistic practices, its historic artistic practices and contemporary art making.
And apropos that, well, in a kind of deeper layer of it, what you spoke about, ritual and meaning and the significance of these practices, how the object that's made becomes the center of a much more deeper, nuanced understanding of that culture. We're not categorizing the object as the kind of final and only thing. You speak about the tea and the drinking and the ritual, and somehow, in a sense, the kind of vacuum in the West, because of this kind of institutional, kind of colonial concept of organizing the world in that hierarchy, and that kind of hollowness at the core, which comes from this sort of disengagement with the meaning. I often talk about Giorgio Morandi, and the way he painted those beautiful, simple objects, in a way trying to tell us that the object contains the mystery. And you have it in this tea bowl. You beautifully described that. This lineage that links to a culture which is ancient, but it also is active and present through the act of drinking.
And it's interesting because you don't need to go very far to actually find the ritual in its current instantiation. And I was just in Taiwan drinking tea with one of my artists, and he just we were just talking about everything, the tea bowl, the configuration, how the tea tastes differently based upon which tea bowl we're drinking from, all these different kinds of discussions. And we sat there the entire afternoon drinking tea and talking. He just admitted it at the very end. He said, if we weren't drinking tea, we could never have this long of a conversation.
Yeah.
The whole point of the tea ceremony, at least in this context, why are you drinking tea? Because you're visiting a monk off in the mountains. You've traveled days or weeks in order to visit this one monk, right? And you are there and you're going to have an audience with the monk, okay? And what you're going to do is you're not going to drink alcohol because the monks don't drink alcohol. They drink tea. So during your visit, the entire time you're visiting with the monk, you're going to be drinking tea. Okay. So that the duration of that tea drinking is basically the duration of your conversation with that monk, kind of that basic idea. So when you visit somebody today and they serve you tea, they're essentially inviting you to a long conversation. And in fact, if you visit a person in East Asia in their house and they don't serve you tea, the expectation is that you will leave quickly. You will take care of your business and you will leave quickly.
Is that an
No,
insult?
no. It's just simply a way of communicating. I'm sorry, I don't have time to have an extended conversation with you today. If I did, we would be drinking tea right now.
Jonathan and I frequently speak about in the podcast is this kind of hegemony of atheism that has become the modern religion of contemporary art theory, and something that we really, there's a yearning to decouple from it. It's just speaking about God in whatever form is just such an intellectual taboo in contemporary art. And yet, even with Western artists, right, when you sit down and talk to them in private, in a safe space, everyone confesses to having a spiritual connection and working in partnership with the greater universe or whatever it is, on making the work that they don't. And it's only the most, I guess, superficial artists who claim pure authorship of their work, right? And yet they're aggrandized, but then they talk very well about their work, right? And I always distrust intrinsically artists who are way too articulate about their practices. It's true, because if you're really putting traces of your spiritual practice and your connection with the universe, it is such a private and intimate thing. It's almost like parading your nakedness. Who is comfortable parading their nakedness? But, and we can draw conclusions. I mean, I admit my language is far more brutal than yours, Craig. I identify as a polarizing figure in the art world. So I don't mind, my new commitment is to not be afraid to be disliked. So that's just, and I think this kind of atheism is also really unscientific as time goes on. It's like the more you analyze contemporary art theory, it is so reactionary in so many ways. Like to the progress that we're making in science. So now, are they waiting for science to catch up to spirituality, which it's catching up really rapidly right now, even over the last couple of years? We've seen the advancements in quantum physics and understanding of of consciousness. The big problem just puts art like just so deeply stuck in the 20th century. It's really extraordinary. And yet that commitment to eliminating the personal as a valid, starting point for anything social is really there.